Ecocide is broadly understood to mean mass damage and destruction of nature. And it's increasingly a word that's being used to describe the destruction of the natural world. The thing is, we have many laws in place around the world. There is an environmental law, a body of law, that has grown up over the last 3 to 4 decades. But it's mostly in the regulatory sphere, so the sort of civil arena. And when you improve regulation, what you tend to adjust in the corporate sphere is budgets. In other words, corporations will budget for fines or court cases that might arise from their activities. But it doesn't really change behavior. And criminal law has the potential to do that. And that's why it's so important that the level of making ecocide a crime comes in. And to do so at the international level is particularly important because, well, when you think about it, we would never go to a government and say, can I kill 500 people for my new infrastructure project? It literally wouldn't cross our minds. But we don't have that same sort of healthy recoil from the destruction of nature. We don't have the same taboo. And so by putting destruction of nature up there alongside genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, what we're saying is it matters just as much. It's just as important to protect nature, but also it's just as serious when we destroy nature. And I think this also speaks to a very long-term, centuries old really, alienation that we have in the Western world, which obviously is the dominant global paradigm at the moment. That alienation from nature, where we don't consider ourselves to be part of nature. Ecocide law really speaks to a kind of almost a universal law that for indigenous cultures is very much part of the DNA, if you like, which is this law of reciprocity. There's something around, if we damage Mother Earth, there are consequences. It's a quid pro quo, if you like, and that's actually a fact. That's not something that we make up in our sort of intellectual, development of our intellectual ideas. That is something we are seeing playing out in the world and playing out right now in ever more apocalyptic ways. That effectively, when we cause damage, there are repercussions, and so to reflect that in the legal paradigm is actually a very powerful thing to do because there's a kind of fundamental truth about that. I experienced UN negotiations for the first time recently and saw how slow and difficult it is for so many countries to come to kind of agreements over wording. And, we've seen negotiations lasting 20 years around the Paris Agreement, for example, the climate agreements, and now, the biodiversity agreements as well. And there's this rising frustration that with all the best intentions in the world, and with policies and statements that look very good on paper, we're simply not seeing the action that is commensurate with the reality out there in the world and that science has been telling us about for decades. So what that tells me is that, clearly the knowledge isn't enough. And actually the goodwill isn't enough either. And I think that there are a number of reasons for this, but there are 2 sort of key ones that spring to mind. One is around sort of legal obligation or sort of fiduciary duties, if you like, in the context of the corporate world. There is effectively a kind of baseline obligation to maximize shareholder return. And of course, in the example that I gave about, you can't ask a government, for a permit to kill people, criminal law has to be complied with in following that duty. And so when you create a new ground rule, what you're doing is you're saying that those corporations are actually, in a way, they're free to say to their shareholders, actually, do you know what? We can't do that because we're no longer allowed to. And we can't risk creating this level of harm. So you're actually creating a tool for moving in a new direction. The other point, I think, is that there is a kind of basic psychology of inertia. That's just perhaps a tragic, but a very human trait. So, most people, many of us, simply won't change our habits unless we have to. So, we can know that, eating a particular thing is bad for us, or we can know that, a particular kind of behavior is not helpful. But unless external circumstances force us, or unless we are constrained by legal obligations, we won't actually change. And so what we're seeing with all of these multilateral agreements is this frustration that the actual action isn't emerging out of them. And, we would say that actually is because the legal framework is missing. And ecocide law as a criminal kind of, these are the worst things that you're not allowed, these are the things you're absolutely not allowed to do, acts as a kind of a guardrail, a safety rail, and also a kind of a guidance system. Because when you have particular limits or parameters, that actually frees you up to really think about what you can do within that space. What is the relationship between ecocide law and the rights of nature, for example? Now, there's a really big movement now around the world for rights of nature. And in fact, Europe has just seen its first ecosystem being granted legal rights, and that's the Mar Menor in Spain. And the first step was literally taken this week, I believe, towards granting rights to this saltwater lagoon in Spain. And there are many landscape features around the world in I think 20 plus jurisdictions that have been given legal rights. And we see that as very complementary to the criminal law of ecocide. It feels like the other side of the same coin in a way. I mean, a very simple way to explain it might be, our basic human right is the right to life, but that right is protected by the fact that murder is a crime. If murder's not a crime, your right to life doesn't actually mean that much. It's an important statement, but in terms of real protection in the world, the criminal law provides that. So there is this kind of reciprocal, there's this kind of two sides of a coin relationship going on here. But we would also say that ecocide law is almost a bridge to a more profound shift in the legal system, because our legal system is hugely anthropocentric. It centers around people, and actually sometimes more around property even. And we have this strange situation where a company is a legal person, and yet a river in most places is not, and yet one could say that the river is a lot more real than the company. So there are some interesting. Really kind of basic philosophical dynamics around that come into play. And of course, I mean, one of the things that was interesting actually around the drafting of this definition was that we did a public consultation before the sort of panel began their drafting. And one part of that was listening to Indigenous voices from the different continents. And one thing that was really striking was that there was no division between people and nature. It was all culture, effectively. It was all this intertwined way of thinking. The formal procedure for getting this law in place at the international level has 4 stages. The first is proposal, which is a formal proposal which can come from any state which is a member of the International Criminal Court. So the beauty of that is that it doesn't have to be one of the big economic players. It can be one of the small island states, for example, or sometimes, as we call them, the Great Ocean states from the Pacific, such as Vanuatu, which was the first state to bring this conversation onto the international table at the International Criminal Court. Ideally, we would suggest that more than one state making that proposal would be more powerful. So perhaps a small group of states. And then that has to be accepted for discussion at the next assembly of the International Criminal Court of the states parties. And then there's the process of negotiation and effectively developing the text to the point that the member states are happy, and then it can be adopted. So that's the third stage, and that's the longest stage, if you like. And then there's ratification, and some states will ratify straight away, and some will over time, as with most treaties. The exciting thing about going for the particular route that we do, which is via the ICC, is it is the only global mechanism which taps directly into the criminal justice systems of the member states. So if you ratify something at the ICC, you have to include it in your own domestic legislation. So it's a way of creating a coherence across borders and across jurisdictions that's really important. So it's really important, particularly in the level of environmental destruction, because so much of the in a sense, some of the worst offenders are transnational corporations who can operate in different jurisdictions, and they can move according to where they think the rules are more lax. So to have an international rule in place that is then adopted into national laws is actually a very efficient, ultimately, way of doing that. We've been asked sometimes, why are you aiming for the international level rather than each national jurisdiction? And of course, we would never tell anybody not to legislate nationally, but obviously you create a coherence by doing it in the international route. But also you're then supporting those in states where the national laws perhaps are not actually adequate to deal with something like this. And therefore, at least there's a knowledge that there can be a recourse to the International Criminal Court. So that's one aspect. But the other is that people often ask, how is this enforceable? It's not a separate legal situation. Effectively, it's not like the European Court of Human Rights, which is a sort of separate court, if you like. This is actually directly relating to the criminal justice system in your country. So if your country ratifies this crime, then prosecutions can take place in your country, in the normal way, in your courts. So it's not like a whole new system has to be created. And that actually is very important. And while over time, we imagine that environmental courts are actually going to be something that will probably evolve, at the present moment, this is actually one of the most practical ways, to get a law that is usable and enforceable in many different countries. And even countries that are not members of the ICC. Let's say that an American corporation is engaging in ecocidal activity in a country that is a member, then a prosecution can be taken in that country. You even have a situation where some countries use principles of universal jurisdiction. Just to pull an example out of the air, Belgium has used universal jurisdiction or universal competence in the past, and they're actually quite a front runner in this conversation. So let's imagine that Belgium ratifies this crime. They could potentially arrest anyone passing through their territory that they feel is committing ecocide, regardless of whether that person comes from a member state or is even committing ecocide in a member state. So there is a breadth of applicability that is not always visible at first glance. We're often asked how long this could take. Our estimate is something between 3 and 5 years to the stage at which it could be beginning to be ratified. And that may feel like a long time, but as I was mentioning earlier, that period is actually hugely important, because that period almost acts as a compliance period, the period where people can see it coming, because that is the window for strategic change. And of course, not everybody will ratify immediately, but we're already seeing changes in how people are approaching decision-making and investment, for example, simply in the knowledge that this definition is out there. And that's really interesting. The International Corporate Governance Network, which is an investor-led network of global asset managers, so big banks and financial firms, they issued a statement to COP26. And one of their recommendations to governments was to collaborate internationally to criminalize ecocide. And what that tells us is brilliant, because it tells us that the investment community at the highest level, these people are managing tens of trillions of dollars, are realizing that, firstly, having the rules in place creates a level of stability. So it manages the risk that they're always, weighing up these in their risk and governance frameworks, if you like. But secondly, that they're actually taking notice of what's happening in the world and saying something really serious needs to be done. This is whatever we're doing up till now isn't working. And I think it's really interesting that the corporate world is ahead of the politicians, actually. For us, obviously, our key focus is recognizing the crime and, shifting the whole legal framework. But it's really interesting that it was born out of also this kind of complementary impulse to support those who are calling for that change. And I think that also brings us to, what ecocide crime criminalizing ecocide can do for environmental defenders, because at the moment we have a situation whereby those who stand up to, against big corporations to protect the environment are often framed as the criminals. And, we see it in a small way with the protests where people are accused of obstructing the road, but we see it in a much more extreme way in places like the Amazon, where earth defenders are disappeared or murdered and so on. And the framing of it sort of culturally, sort of in the media, perhaps, is around interrupting legal business activity. And so therefore they're the criminals. As soon as you put in place a law that says the activity itself might be criminal, you have a complete flip of that narrative. It means that those people are no longer obstructive criminals. They're actually moral upholders of the law. And that's a really, again, a profound shift. It literally turns it on its head in terms of, where those people stand. And it gives earth defenders, whether local communities, indigenous communities and so on, a tool, to really be able to protect the lands that they care about and that are so culturally intertwined with their lives. Civil disobedience is a really important ingredient in everything that's happening at the moment, because when the current laws are inadequate and, clearly the system is dysfunctional in a certain way, and those who are in the policy-making positions or the law-making positions are not moving fast enough to address the situation, then actually civil disobedience or disruption of business as usual is actually a really important way of drawing attention. And if we look historically at all the major shifts in, serious shifts in human rights, whether it's the abolition of slavery, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's gay marriage, whether it's women's rights, all of these aspects, there's been a huge aspect of civil disobedience in bringing the issue to the attention of policymakers and showing how serious the feeling is about it. In other words, bringing the moral imperative. And that is hugely important. And it also allows movements like the Stop Ecocide movement, for example, to then move into that space and say, okay, so the problem has been highlighted. The disruption and the disobedience has highlighted the problem. Now here is a solution. Here is what we can do about it. And sometimes, that those cracks need to be opened in order for, the new solutions to come into place. I think also, for me personally, this particular movement, this particular initiative, if you like, it feels like both very surgically precise and yet potentially hugely strategic and broad in its implications. And so for me personally, it literally feels like the biggest game in town. And I cannot imagine anything more exciting to be doing. So, that keeps me going in many ways. But another aspect is actually really keeping connected to the earth itself. And I have to say that again, personally, perhaps as a meditative practice, every single day I get my bare feet onto the ground, even if it's just for a few minutes, to really connect with why I'm doing all of this. The earth sustains all of us. We can't breathe, we can't eat, we can't drink, unless we have healthy ecosystems around us, unless the natural living world is healthy. And it's directly interconnected with our own health, with our own life, with our own inspiration. And so I think that maintaining that connection as a practice is also very important. By nature, I'm definitely an optimist. My fundamental belief is that unless you believe in the possibility of something, how can you possibly manifest it? You have to know it's possible and you have to know it in your bones. I think that I feel like our job as a movement is hugely about empowerment. It's about hope. It's about giving people back agency, and actually, having people realize that when you're absolutely determined to create something that you know is the right thing, it's actually remarkable how much starts to move with you. And I think that often those in our society who understand how much power they have as human beings don't necessarily use it for the best purposes. Perhaps they were educated to feel that wealth or power were the desirable things to have. But when you look at small children interacting with nature, they don't need any prompting. They understand totally intuitively what that connection is. It's educated out of them. And so, I sort of feel like there's something really powerful about, firstly, really connecting with nature and kind of, feeling that sense of connection. But also, it's very powerful to be positive and to look for the joy in things. It's very easy to see a bit of a polarity appearing in the world between denial and despair. And actually what's missing there is a sort of practical hope. I mean, what Joanna Macy might call it an active hope, I suppose. But there is already quite a lot of evidence to show that when people take action, whatever that action is, it already helps a lot in terms of the psychological space of how frightening it can be to be living at this time. And I also feel like those of us who can take action actually have a responsibility to do so. Not least because, those of us in the wealthy North are largely to blame for a lot of what is going on in the world. It is therefore our absolute responsibility to do something about it. I think there's a balance to be struck. And I think that I really understand that. And I think I understand how activists, get burnt out and feel potentially sort of apart from others. And I think there is a sense that there are some conversations that one doesn't have patience for anymore. And I do kind of understand that. But at the same time, so much of this is actually about being with each other. And actually, when people care about things, whether that thing is, my daughter wanting to show me her latest TikTok videos, for example, that's wonderful because it's something she wants to share with me. And I think we must never forget that the sharing is important, whatever level that's at, and that it can be frustrating if not everybody feels like they're awake to the thing that you're talking about. But, we're all different and we all have parts to play. And I think the balance is important. And I would certainly say that thinking about my dear departed friend, Polly Higgins, who literally lived and breathed Ecocide law. And one could say that she worked herself to death. I mean, that, she actually died of cancer, but it was what has been described medically as a stress-induced type of cancer. So it is actually really important to connect with ourselves, with our families, with our communities as well. And that for me is one of the reasons that I do that meditative practice of connecting with the earth every day. Because I think that there is a sort of groundedness that we have to remember. Because individually, we can't fix everything, and we want to. And we want people to listen all the time, and we want them to act all the time. And yet, it's all a cumulative practice and an interactive practice. And I think that perhaps it's easy for me to say that because what I'm particularly working on literally feels like the hope in the situation, and obviously that's a really empowering thing. And raising the alarm on what's going wrong could be a lot heavier in some ways. So I do very much sympathise with that. People often ask, what kinds of activities will be criminalised with Ecocide? It's actually a tricky one to answer in the specifics because, as with any criminal law, it will, each case will depend on the individual facts and how that relates to the text of the crime. But the kinds of things, we also imagine that initial prosecutions, once this is in place, will be very clear-cut cases because lawyers wanting to cut their teeth in this area, and there will be many, I'm sure, who want to be the first on the block to prosecute Ecocide, will probably choose cases that are relatively clear to understand, big toxic pollution cases, for example. But the kinds of things that we imagine that could be addressed are things that are kind of at the extreme end of extractive activities, whether that might be, for example, it might be deep sea mining, it might be certain kinds of industrial farming or what have you. And it won't necessarily be the activity per se. It will be the particular method or the scale or, those kinds of things potentially. But I think that there are some areas where things get quite grey, and plastic pollution is one, for example. I mean, it's very visible in the sense that, you see these images of like beaches just and water just filled with bottles and packets and all of this. And of course, that sort of littering end of it is often a collective thing. But with an international crime, you're going to be looking at something that can be traced back to a certain act or a certain decision. So those kinds of very broad, everybody's doing it kind of things will be difficult in this context. But for example, there may well be incidences. I mean, the pollution incidents in the production of plastics is one aspect, but there may also be, again, dumping aspects. These kinds of things that relate to the world of plastic pollution that could potentially fall under Ecocide. But I think that one of the key things that we really must look at here is that, as with all criminal law, actually, the intention is not fundamentally to punish the perpetrators. Obviously, that's the function of it once it's in place. The intention is to deter. The intention is to prevent. Now, and this is really interesting in the light of there's a lot of climate litigation going on around the world, and it's really important, and environmental litigation. It's really important because it provides, provides case law, jurisprudence that's built up. It provides banks of evidence that can also potentially then be used in criminal cases. It helps the narrative, and it names and shames in some cases, affects the PR of certain companies and so on. But what it doesn't do is change behavior. And that's the difference with criminal law, because what you're basically saying is that, look, in a few years' time, this will not be permitted, and you will have your personal freedom on the line. And that's the interesting thing as well. It's not corporations we're talking about at the international crime level. It's not corporations and it's not governments. It's people. It's actual natural persons. So it's, the CEO or the government minister, even the head of state, potentially. So it's personal criminal responsibility. And when you see that in the balance, when you make your decision, you may well start making different decisions in a way that you wouldn't do if you can hide behind the corporate veil and simply cough up a fine if something goes wrong. So, there is this sense that the importance of this is the preventative side, because what we're ultimately trying to do here is actually, we're not trying to punish, we're trying to protect. We want a livable planet. Ultimately, if the heads of fossil fuel companies are in the dock, that's one thing. But what would be so much better is if in that time they sat there and the I don't know, the Monsantos of this world, or the whoever it is, if they were to sit there and make those decisions in a different way because of what they can see coming, then you've got real traction. Then you've got real protection going on. And that's actually the important thing. I feel like this is a really exciting, pivotal moment. I mean, not specifically for me, but for kind of humanity in general. I think this is possibly the first time that, a kind of a single generation has had in their hands, in a way, the future of their entire species. And that's pretty amazing. And actually, when one thinks about it in that context, if that's the framework, and you then say, what am I going to do with my time? That gets pretty interesting.